Good afternoon, and welcome to the Elizabeth Whelan Lecture. My name is Steve Whelan, and for 43 years it was my privilege to be Elizabeth Whelan's husband. Beth was a force of nature, very active in the conservative movement, written up in several books about the rise of the right and elsewhere. In the mid-90s, I had become a bit despairing of practicing law and doing nothing but practicing law. So Beth said, look, we're supporters of the Manhattan Institute. Why don't you get involved with them? Why don't you attend their events? Maybe you could even become a trustee and become a member of the conservative movement the way Beth was. Well, that never happened because at the same time, our daughter Christine was admitted to Princeton University, where she took the Civil Liberties course taught by Professor George. And as a result of that, 1 year later, in 1999, I was able to precept that same course for Professor George. And so for the next 15 years, until my law firm told me to spend more time doing billable client work. So I never pulled the plug for the Manhattan Institute, but it's my deep pleasure to be here to introduce McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, Professor Robert George, who will give a more traditional introduction to our guest speaker, Reihan Salam.
Thank you so much, Steve. I wish we could afford your billable rates. We'd have you back as a preceptor in a heartbeat. But even Princeton University can't afford those rates. It was an honor to have Steve as a preceptor. We continue to have Steve in the family, though, because Steve did not mention that he's a founding member and a continuing member of the Advisory Council of the James Madison Program on American Ideals and Institutions. And we're really grateful for Steve's service and his support and generosity. Steve can claim Beth as his wife. I can't do that, but I can claim her as a friend, and a dear friend indeed. And we all miss her, and I'm just so glad that we have in the Madison program this wonderful annual opportunity to remember Beth and to thank her for the tremendous contributions that she made. And what a treat it is to welcome to Princeton Reihan Salam. Reihan is the 5th president of the Manhattan Institute, a research and advocacy organization that advances liberty, the rule of law, and the welfare of American cities. He was a 2010 Bernard I. Schwartz Fellow of the New America Foundation and a 2015 Pritzker Fellow out at the University of Chicago. He's the author of Melting Pot or Civil War, ? Published in 2018, and co-author with Ross Douthat, who's been a guest here, of Grand New Party, published in 2008. He's a contributing editor at The Atlantic and at National Affairs and National Review, and a political commentator for CNN. A life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Mr. Salam serves on the Public Scholars Advisory Committee at the Moynihan Center at the City College of New York, the Advisory Council of the Public Interest Fellowship, and the Advisory Board of Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. What a joy it is to welcome as the 2024 Elizabeth M. Whelan Lecturer, Reihan Salam.
Thank you for that kind introduction. First, let me say how grateful I am to be with you all today. The James Madison program has already made an enormous contribution to American public life, and it has served as an inspiration to educational initiatives on campuses across the country. I've had the great pleasure of working alongside many young people shaped by your programming, which has deepened their appreciation for and commitment to our nation's founding ideals. Princeton has a special place in my heart. Many years ago, I was a student at a competitive high school in New York City, which was home to an unusually dense concentration of ambition and talent. Suffice it to say, I was not one of the most academically accomplished students in my class, far from it. But I nevertheless had the nerve to apply to Princeton, a school that at the time seemed intimidatingly exclusive and elite. And in what can only be described as a serious lapse in judgment on the part of the admissions office, I was waitlisted. This was a huge coup for me, perhaps the most academically validating thing that had happened to me up to that point in my life. And though I didn't make it off the wait list in the end, I still think about the rogue admissions officer who so recklessly gambled with the reputation of this storied institution. So thank you to that person, whoever you are. My talk today is about America's racial future and why I'm cautiously optimistic about it. About 25 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I had a wide-ranging conversation with a classmate about what it meant to belong at our elite, then majority white university. She argued that it was important that our commencement exercises include symbols that reflected her identity as a Black American woman, and she assumed that I felt similarly as a person of color, albeit one from a different background. But I didn't, in fact, feel the same way. I had no expectation that my ethnic identity would be validated or recognized by an institution I felt fortunate to attend, but that didn't really owe me anything. While I imagine I came from humbler origins than many of my classmates, I never doubted that I belonged, and that whatever anxiety I felt was more a function of my own quirks or deficiencies than anything more systematic. You could say that while my classmate was a believer in the importance of race consciousness and of having institutions like ours celebrate and elevate her racial self-understanding, I was a partisan of colorblindness. Devotion to colorblindness is a point of view that is often caricatured. There's this line in Shortcomings, the Adrian Tomine graphic novel that was recently adapted into a movie that you can watch on Netflix, where the Japanese-American protagonist Ben Tanaka is asked if he ever felt mistreated or discriminated against. He replies, "Of course, but not because I was Asian. It was because I was a nerd with a bad personality and no social skills." Just to be clear, Ben is not portrayed as an especially wise character. His refusal to see race is ultimately a failing. The implicit line of argument here is that to see race is to be a clear-eyed realist, to live on planet Earth. To not see it is to be naive, or worse still, to evade responsibility for real-world racial hierarchies. 25 years on, I am still a partisan of colorblindness. As the young writer Coleman Hughes recently put it, supporting colorblindness does not mean that you literally do not see race. Rather, supporting colorblindness means that you try your best to treat people without regard to race, and that you generally oppose policies that treat people differently solely on account of their race. In that vein, I am opposed to racial preferences, I am wary of entrenching racial categories in law, and I am sympathetic to the ambitious project of separating race and state. And yet I've come to believe that the language of colorblindness doesn't fully capture what it is that I and other Americans who object to what we see as excessive race consciousness are hoping to achieve. Why did I, a middle-class second-generation American of South Asian Muslim origin, feel at home in an elite, majority-white institution, while my interlocutor, a Black American woman with much deeper roots in the United States, felt very differently? While I saw my ethnic identity as essentially voluntary, as something I chose to reaffirm and affirm, and that I could choose not to do so, depending on mood or circumstance, my sense is that my classmate's self-understanding was markedly different. Through her lens, it was not a matter of indifference whether a commencement ceremony incorporated Black American or African American or Afro-Caribbean symbols and traditions. It was a matter of the utmost importance. For the alternative was to leave unchallenged the powerful stigmatizing assumption that to be a Black American in this elite space was to not belong. The difference between us was the difference between identifying with the American societal mainstream, the domain where ethnic identity is something one chooses, or seeing oneself on our societal margins, where ascribed identities serve as powerful constraints on one's life chances, and where ethnic solidarity and political unity can be understood more as a survival strategy than as a mere preference. In Two Dilemmas for U.S. Race Relations, the Canadian political philosopher Joseph Heath offered a useful framework for understanding this difference in perspective. In a wider comparative context, scholars of ethnicity have distinguished between two different categories of minority ethnic group in modern market democracies. The first consists of culturally distinct immigrant groups, for whom the main objective is equal access to mainstream institutions, religious liberty, and the scope to build and maintain civil society institutions. The second captures national minority groups, typically non-immigrant groups that share a distinct language and culture and, in the ideal type, maintain their own parallel institutions in a well-defined geographical territory. Think of the Quebecois or the Basques. When we view Black Americans through this comparative context, we find a group that defies easy categorization. While over 20% of people of African descent in the US are immigrants or the second-generation descendants of immigrants, most of the rest are the descendants of American slaves. And while these multi-generational Black Americans are disproportionately concentrated in certain regions, in particular the Deep South and urban cores, there's no Black equivalent of Quebec or the Basque Country. Black nationalism is a real phenomenon in American discourse, but it doesn't typically center on calls for sovereignty. Rather, it centers on the preservation of a distinct cultural identity and opposition to full incorporation into the societal mainstream. In elite contexts, it also takes the form of demanding recognition and representation along explicitly racial lines. That is, it involves diverse people of African descent leveraging America's history of racist oppression to secure high-status roles and positions of authority within diverse institutions. Against this backdrop, the pursuit of colorblindness is about more than racial forbearance. It is best understood as an active project of loosening the grip of race consciousness, expanding the American mainstream, curbing the excesses of minority nationalisms, and building an America after racialism. My aim for today is to convince you that this is not an entirely quixotic enterprise, and that we're in fact closer to achieving that vision than we've ever been. Debates over race and racism have long been central to our politics. Indeed, some have argued that the chief dividing line between right and left in America is over racial attitudes, and that views on voting rights, the welfare state, crime control, and public education, among other important questions of public policy, are essentially downstream of how we think about race. There's more than a little truth to that. But while debates over race and racism are as contentious as ever, my sense is that they're very different from the debates of earlier eras. They are more evenly matched, both in political terms and in terms of moral legitimacy. While most Americans agree that race relations are bad or very bad, there is deep disagreement over what it would mean for race relations to materially improve. That is the crux of today's race debate. Is the problem with race in America best understood as the persistence of racial disparities in income, wealth, and elite representation, regardless of whether they're the product of state-enforced discrimination or the uneven distribution of social capital across families and informal networks at a given point in time? Or is the problem the brightness of the boundaries separating minority ethnic groups from the mainstream? Call this the distinction between anti-racism and anti-racialism. Anti-racists and anti-racialists both want racial progress, but they have a drastically different understanding of what racial progress would look like. The anti-racist conception of racial progress necessitates race-conscious approaches, as race-neutral approaches that continue to yield disparities fail to remedy the problem by definition. The anti-racialist conception, in contrast, would incline us against entrenching racial categories in law. Until recently, anti-racists have been ascendant. According to leading proponents of this view, such as Ibram Kendi or Nicole Hannah-Jones, racism is the defining fact of American life, and the old colorblind liberalism is woefully insufficient to addressing it. The only way our racist history, in their view, to overcome our racist history is for Americans to become more explicitly conscious of race and racism, embracing educational paradigms that center race and policies that aim not for equal treatment, but for equity or equal outcomes among groups. As Kendi summarized this position, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. These ideas have become commonplace in elite liberal institutions, from universities to the media to the Democratic Party. And this elite shift has trickled down through the wider Democratic electorate, especially among educated and affluent Democrats, for whom anti-racism has become an intellectual lodestar. Consider the Biden administration's equity agenda, an ambitious effort to embed race consciousness in federal policymaking. At the state and local level, a rising generation of progressive elected officials have embraced decarceration and depolicing to address disparities in criminal justice outcomes. Many have also sought to dismantle selective public education and the use of standardized testing on broadly similar grounds. Bracketing the question of whether anti-racism offers an accurate diagnosis of contemporary American life, it has a clear appeal to certain powerful constituencies who've been willing to advance its tenets, even when doing so is proven politically costly. What is less well understood, however, is the opposition to progressive anti-racism. Over the last several years, we've seen a wave of parental complaints and legislation against anti-racist school curricula, critical race theory, as it's been called, and backlash against politicians and district attorneys who have adopted anti-racism-inflected approaches to crime and public safety. In the eyes of the anti-racists themselves, the campaigns against CRT, affirmative action, and progressive criminal justice reform are just racism, a form of white backlash against the growing political power of minorities that is all the more insidious for professing to be colorblind. Slightly more difficult to account for is the fact that on many contentious racial issues, non-white minorities are more aligned with the so-called white backlashers than with the progressive anti-racists. Shortly before the Supreme Court struck down race-conscious admissions at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, 59% of blacks, 68% of Hispanics, and 63% of Asians agreed that race should not be a factor in college admissions. And research from my Manhattan Institute colleague Zach Goldberg has shown that white liberals consistently express stronger agreement with many tenets of the anti-racist worldview than do minorities. More generally, as the Democratic Party has become more and more identified with elite anti-racism, it has actually shed support among non-whites, especially Hispanics. Some anti-racists have sought to explain away these phenomena by invoking concepts like multiracial whiteness, the idea that minorities adopt white values in order to curry favor with a white supremacist system. There's a grain of truth there in that many non-whites really are aligned with the mainstream American values derided by elite liberals as racist. But a better way to interpret their worldview, and that of many of the leading critics of liberal anti-racism, is that it is not racist at all. Instead, it's what we've called anti-racialism. If progressive anti-racism is grounded in the idea that raising the salience of race is essential to achieving racial justice, anti-racialism holds that heightened race consciousness and the racialization of disparities and differences that would obtain in any culturally plural society more often than not cuts against fostering integration, civic harmony, and social progress. Among anti-racist scholars, efforts to lower the salience of race are often denounced as manifestations of laissez-faire racism, as they ignore or downplay the cumulative and multidimensional nature of racial disadvantage. Yet anti-racialism is a potent political force precisely because it resonates with important aspects of our country's changing racial landscape. First, anti-racialism speaks to the emergence of a new multi-ethnic mainstream, which marks a departure from the system of black-white, minority-majority race relations that prevailed for most of American history. Put simply, mainstream American culture is no longer white in any narrow sense. Here it's useful to draw a distinction between whiteness and mainstreamness, a more inclusive and capacious concept. In 2020, the legal academic Ian Haney Lopez and human rights lawyer Tori Gavito, both of whom have long been involved in progressive political organizing, reported that while 1/4 of Latinos identified as people of color, a large majority disagreed. Quote, they preferred to see Hispanics as a group integrating into the American mainstream, one not overly bound by racial constraints, but instead able to get ahead through hard work, end quote. This idea of an expanding mainstream is central to the work of the sociologists Richard Alba and Victor Nee, who've defined it as, quote, that part of American society within which ethnic and racial origins have at most minor impacts, end quote. For Americans who have been fully incorporated into the societal mainstream, ethnic identity is, again, more voluntary or symbolic than a powerful force that constrains their choices. In The Great Demographic Illusion, Alba underscores that the American mainstream is not coterminous with whiteness. Just as the white Protestant mainstream that prevailed from colonial times to the middle of the 20th century evolved through the mass assimilation of Catholic and Jewish ethnics after World War II, he writes, the racially defined mainstream of today is changing, at least in some parts of the country, as a result of the inclusion of many non-white and mixed Americans. This is especially true of Americans with roots in Latin America and Asia. Among Hispanic and Asian Americans, intermarriage rates now match or surpass those of Italian and Jewish Americans from the post-war era, a powerful indicator of their incorporation into the mainstream. Granted, one could argue that the black-white divide is simply being supplanted by a black-non-black divide that is no less pernicious and impermeable. Consider that the intermarriage rate among black Americans lags noticeably behind other minority ethnic groups, even after accounting for cross-group differences in education attainment and income. In The Diversity Paradox, the sociologists Jennifer Lee and Frank Bean dubbed this phenomenon black exceptionalism, and it is one of many reasons our discourse on race relations continues to center black Americans. And yet there's reason to believe that a growing number of black Americans are being incorporated into the expanding mainstream as well, as evidenced by changing black political behavior. There have always been black conservatives who embrace an anti-racialist perspective. For example, when asked if black Americans should work their way up without special favors, the same way the Irish, Italians, and Jews did, a statement that would be considered beyond the pale in many elite media and academic institutions, the 2020 American National Election Survey found that about 20% of blacks agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, with another 20% saying they neither agreed nor disagreed. As the political scientists Ismail White and Cheryl Laird document in Steadfast Democrats, black Americans have remained largely united behind Democratic candidates. But White and Laird attribute this African-American political unity to the practice of racialized social constraint, in which some black individuals work to protect the interests of the group by shaming or otherwise punishing other black individuals who threaten to defect from the group's partisan norm. Because the vast majority of Black Americans have belonged to predominantly Black social networks throughout U.S. history, defecting from the group's partisan norm has been exceedingly costly, which helps explain why ideologically conservative Blacks tend to support Democrats who don't share their sensibilities. Racialized social constraint is less binding, however, for Black conservatives who belong to more diverse social networks, in which non-Black friends and associates can give them more room to defy group political expectations. As long as the vast majority of Black Americans remain intensely racially isolated, Democrats will continue to win large supermajorities of the Black vote. Of course, this also means that as residential integration, rising education attainment, and geographic and social mobility continue to take hold, racialized social constraint will grow less binding, a point that White and Laird make explicitly. This might explain why Donald Trump fared better with African Americans in 2020 than in 2016, and why at least some recent surveys suggest that Democrats are slipping further among Black voters in the Biden era. Indeed, this rightward shift has been especially pronounced among younger, secular, working-class Black voters, which neatly fits the racialized social constraint thesis. These are Black Americans who came of age in the 1990s and 2000s, against a backdrop of rising Black cultural and political influence. They are not embedded in the Black church, an institution that has played a crucial role in inculcating norms of racial solidarity, and they are not embedded in the modern university, where racial identity and racial preferences have been most salient. One important takeaway from this new divide between anti-racists and anti-racialists is that, to paraphrase the political scientists John Sides and Michael Tesler, while Americans are more polarized about race than in the recent past, they are less polarized by race. As recently as a decade ago, progressive intellectuals were confident that the demographic transformation of the American electorate would soon yield a progressive majority that would unite college-educated white liberals, Black Americans, and working-class immigrants and their descendants, a rainbow coalition that would vanquish a reactionary coalition composed of aging, defensive, nostalgic rural whites. For example, in their 2015 book, White Backlash, the sociologists Marisa Abrajano and Zoltan Hajnal warned that rapid demographic change was warping America's political psyche, and that a widening racial gap in party identification was a sign of, quote, a nation in danger of being driven apart. Over the longer term, however, Abrajano and Hajnal predicted that as Latin immigrants and their descendants came to represent a larger share of the electorate, the tide of white backlash would recede, and progressivism would again be ascendant. But as we've discussed, that isn't quite how things have panned out. The working-class Latin voters whom Abrajano and Hajnal saw delivering lasting progressive majorities are in fact trending right. This realization is already shaping the calculations of political professionals on the left. Earlier this month, the Washington Post reported that progressive activists were starting to have doubts about voter registration drives, long a mainstay of progressive political organizing. The reason? As an influential progressive data scientist put it in a confidential memo, quote, if we were to blindly register non-voters and get them on the rolls, we would be distinctly aiding Donald Trump's quest for a personal dictatorship, end quote. He also warned that because so many younger non-voters and non-Black people of color were trending right, the only safe bet was for progressive nonprofits, nonpartisan, keep this in mind, to focus exclusively on registering Black voters. And so the future of American politics won't pit a multi-ethnic rainbow coalition on one side of the political ideological divide against a monoracial white coalition on the other. Ideological conflict, class conflict, and racial conflict won't line up along neat lines of fracture. This might strike you as a good and healthy development. That's certainly how I see it. But for some on the left, this rainbow versus reactionary vision of apocalyptic racial conflict had a powerful moral resonance. Progressive anti-racists envisioned a conflict between right and left as more than an ideological struggle. It was a struggle between oppressors and oppressed, between perpetrators of racial injustice and victims of racial injustice, bolstered crucially by righteous white allies. As we approach the midpoint of this decade, what's emerging instead is something more morally ambiguous, a clash between two multi-ethnic coalitions. The multi-ethnic coalition on the left, united by a particular, and some would say idiosyncratic, vision for racial progress, is arrayed against a multi-ethnic coalition on the right, united by its opposition to that vision. The conflict between anti-racists and anti-racialists is an ideological conflict about race, not a conflict in which white supremacists are subjugating despised and marginalized racial others. While this conflict certainly has high stakes, it bears no moral resemblance to Bull Connor ordering the use of fire hoses and police dogs on civil rights protesters. For all her professed racial progressivism, Catherine Marr, the chief executive of National Public Radio, is not the moral equivalent of Martin Luther King Jr. Chinese American parents fighting for race-blind admissions in the selective public schools of Fairfax County, Virginia, are not arch segregationists. We can try to pretend otherwise. It may well be profitable to pretend otherwise or comforting. But it is an exercise that strains credulity and that has increasingly become the stuff of caricature. The main challenge facing anti-racialism today is that it is still a non-elite phenomenon. Although it represents the unarticulated common sense of vast swaths of the electorate, it has few high-status champions and scant presence in prestige media. For ambitious people looking to ascend through prestigious legacy institutions or positions of national influence, it remains costly to focus on the ways in which the current progressive consensus is unrepresentative of how most Americans, including many Americans of color, think about race. But this elite reluctance represents an enormous opportunity for conservatives willing to appeal to the untapped anti-racialist majority. Before I turn to how conservatives might capitalize on this opportunity, I want to pause to tell you a bit more about my personal experience and how it has informed my perspective on race. In 1989, my parents purchased a small two-family house in Brooklyn, New York, and our immediate next-door neighbors were a Korean couple, a taxi driver, and a small business owner. And the wife, as I recall, ran a flower shop in Flatbush. A few months later, after we first met, she found herself caught up in what's come to be known as the Church Avenue boycott. Local black activists rallied black residents to stop patronizing Korean-owned businesses, an effort sparked by claims that the owner of one Flatbush grocery store had mistreated a Haitian-American customer. A number of violent incidents ensued, and there was a real sense that New York City was on the edge of serious and sustained racial strife. Not long after that, in the summer of 1991, 2 black children died in a car accident in Crown Heights. And though the driver of the car in question had no ill intent, it happens that he was a member of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement. The weeks that followed saw ferocious racial violence targeting observant Jews in the neighborhood. Remember that this was the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union was unraveling. Yugoslavia descended into ethnic warfare, and it wasn't entirely clear that culturally plural societies had a bright future. I don't want to exaggerate, Brooklyn wasn't Bosnia, but I could sense a certain anxiety among the adults in my life. My parents had moved to Brooklyn in 1976 from Bangladesh, a young republic that was itself the product of ethnic turmoil, and they had lived through civil war, ethnic cleansing, and the breakdown of civil order. Was that turmoil going to follow them to their new home? That was very much on their minds. Despite the tension in the air, my parents, and really my father, who died recently, was committed to living in polyglot Brooklyn. Our Bengali-speaking friends mostly left for the suburbs, where the houses were spacious and you were a lot less likely to get mugged. And my mother wanted to follow them. But my father loved city life, and so did I. So we stayed put. And then something unexpected happened. New York City became safer, dramatically safer. And Brooklyn went from a metonym for urban crime, poverty, and disorder to a metonym for smug urban affluence. This all unfolded against a rapidly diversifying population. The architect of this transformation was Rudy Giuliani, a political figure who has been greatly diminished over the intervening years, but to whom I remain enormously grateful. When Giuliani was first inaugurated as mayor of New York City just over 30 years ago, he explicitly rejected his predecessor David Dinkins' commitment to building a diverse administration that reflected the city's changing ethnic makeup. Rather, he committed himself to a strategy of one city, one standard. That is, he pledged to choose his staff on the basis of merit alone, and the team he assembled went on to spark a renaissance in what was then the nation's most diverse metropolis. In doing so, Giuliani and his successor, Michael Bloomberg, lifted the fortunes of millions of New Yorkers, my family very much among them, and most of these New Yorkers, of course, were people of color. Often accused of racism, Giuliani in his prime was guilty of something else entirely: a refusal to condescend to people on the basis of race, or to believe that a legacy of deprivation or historical injustice meant that a given individual shouldn't be held to account for his or her failure to meet basic standards of civility. I didn't see Giuliani's one city, one standard credo as racism when I was a young man, and I don't see it as racism now. But as I later discovered, the consensus among social scientists studying race was that I didn't have a sufficiently sophisticated understanding of how racism had evolved in the post-civil rights era. For years, social scientists have relied on modern racism scales to study intergroup attitudes. This is a rich, complex subject that I won't be able to do justice to today. The short version is that as overt racism declined in the decades following the civil rights movement, scholars sought to understand how racial attitudes in particular were changing. The idea was that overt racism was being supplanted by what was dubbed symbolic racism or racial resentment. Think of a person, let's call her Karen, who says that she is not at all prejudiced against blacks, but who believes that the persistence of black disadvantage is more a reflection of the choices made by particular black individuals or black families than of structural barriers. According to the modern racism framework, Karen would count as racially resentful. There is a rich literature that uses these modern racism scales to make sense of partisan political divides in the US. And at the risk of oversimplification, the upshot is that to be a racial liberal is to be lacking in racial resentment, and to be a racial conservative is to be racially resentful. If this sounds to you a bit like saying that to be on the political right is to suffer from an egregious character flaw, well, I could see where you're coming from. But what if racially resentful Karen said the exact same thing about Lithuanians, Bangladeshis, working-class white natives, Appalachians, or the left-handed, as she did about blacks when presented with the same vignette? In that case, it's not obvious, to me at least, that the language of racism, modern or otherwise, is especially helpful. The Harvard political scientists Ryan Enos and Riley Carney recently found that the Karen scenario I've laid out is roughly how so-called modern racism manifests itself in practice. That is, quote, modern racism questions appear to measure attitudes toward any group rather than African Americans alone. Enos and Carney suggest that these scales are capturing two different phenomena. First, racial sympathy toward blacks, understood as a belief that black Americans have been uniquely damaged by the history of slavery and segregation, and that it is therefore wrong to evaluate them as we would members of other groups. And second, just world belief, or the belief that hard work generally pays off and people are largely responsible for their life outcomes, regardless of race. One awkward fact for the partisans of the modern racism thesis is that it's not just whites who appear to be racially resentful. For as long as modern racism scales have been around, many Black, Latin, and Asian respondents have expressed the belief that blacks are more or less similar to other human beings, and that US society, while imperfect, does generally allow people of any race or color to succeed by virtue of their own merits. That is, these scales have found that these Black, Latin, and Asian respondents are symbolic racists. So to kind of reframe what we were talking about earlier on about the changing political scene, in the Obama era, the electorate was less polarized about race because non-white racial conservatives backed Democrats, and more polarized by race for the same reason. And in a sense, this represented a kind of stolen valor for progressive anti-racists. They could operate under the illusion that they enjoyed the monolithic support of people of color, when in fact many of them supported Democrats despite their commitment to progressive anti-racism. That is no longer true, and that is why anti-racialism is poised to reshape the American political landscape. By now, I hope I've convinced you that the discourse of race in American life has changed, and that a diverse coalition has emerged in opposition to progressive race consciousness or racialism. The question then is, what should this nascent anti-racialist coalition be fighting for? There are many policies that could fit the bill: curbing the excesses of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, rolling back minority contracting requirements that raise costs for taxpayers, including minority taxpayers, banning racial preferences in the public sector, and perhaps even changing how we categorize Americans by race and national origin to offer a richer and less racialized portrait of American diversity. I'd embrace every one of these policies, and I'm proud to say that my colleagues at the Manhattan Institute have done a great deal to advance them. But I would encourage anti-racialists to pursue a broader ambition, to fight for policies that foster public safety, upward mobility, and wealth creation for all Americans, regardless of color. Doing so would inevitably have a disproportionate impact on those who found themselves on the margins of American life. Consider the mounting evidence that the main obstacle to Black advancement isn't racial bias from non-Blacks. It is the intense concentration of Black families in neighborhoods dominated by fragile families, where cross-class, cross-race interactions that transmit social capital to lower-income families are largely unknown. Mere geographic proximity isn't enough. For the child of a single parent to build social capital, she needs to actually have meaningful relationships with her more affluent neighbors, not just share the same zip code. Needless to say, there's no policy that can compel individuals of any race to form friendships across lines of class and color. But there's one set of policies that can make these relationships much more likely. Policies that combat violent crime, policies that ironically have been caught up in this conflict between anti-racism and anti-racialism. As banal as this might sound, I'd argue that effective crime control would do much more to improve the fortunes of disadvantaged black and brown Americans than even the most aggressive equity agenda the Biden administration could dream up. That is one reason the Manhattan Institute is so focused on law enforcement and why we've been so willing to buck the elite consensus. Among progressive anti-racists, it is an article of faith that the U.S. spends far too much on the carceral state and that we're in the midst of a crisis of over-incarceration. I would argue that we don't spend or incarcerate nearly enough. In-custody deaths are at shockingly high levels, and between a quarter and half of former prisoners reoffend within 5 years of release. Our penitentiaries do house a large number of offenders, but that doesn't mean they have the resources to protect or rehabilitate them. One could trace this chronic underinvestment at least as far back as the Jim Crow South, when underfunded law enforcement agencies were strikingly indifferent to violence against black Americans. In The Collapse of American Criminal Justice, the legal academic William J. Stuntz observed that while killers of white Americans in that era could generally expect a vigorous response from the criminal justice system, killers of blacks, regardless of race, were very likely to go free. And as the journalist Jill Leovy observed in Ghettoside, the absence of effective crime control in black communities in that era gave rise to vigilantism. Many black individuals who found no recourse in turning to the law felt compelled to take matters into their own hands. That pattern reverberates even now. In recent years, black Americans have been the victims in over 60% of all gun homicides, most of which go unsolved and unpunished by the law. There are zip codes in the United States where young black men are more likely to be killed than if they served in wartime Iraq and Afghanistan. This endemic violence has devastated the civic infrastructure of countless American cities. Lawlessness gives rise to middle-class flight, which in turn diminishes the local tax bases that finance local law enforcement. The isolation and deprivation that results is nothing less than a moral scandal. If you want to expand the mainstream, start by freeing disadvantaged urban neighborhoods from violence and from the small number of chronic offenders that perpetrate it. In doing so, you will change the character of these urban neighborhoods, you will make them more attractive to stable middle-income families, and you will allow more cross-class, cross-race interactions to take root. Fighting crime is a cause worthy of the emerging anti-racialist majority, and it is an excellent starting point for anyone looking to lead it. Don't be intimidated by those who tell you otherwise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Well, we have time for Q&A, so let's begin. Who would like to be first? Any students have questions? We usually observe the custom of student questions first. If not, the floor is open. Oh, yes, Corbin.
I don't want to mischaracterize what you said, but I heard that you were saying that anti-racists and anti-racialists share the same goal of improving race relations. Microphone. Sorry. I thought you were saying that you felt anti-racists and anti-racialists both shared the goal of improving race relations. Would it be more correct to say that the anti-racist, Kendi and his ilk, actually profit from increased racial tensions and have more in common than with the Sharptons and the other race hustlers?
So I want to be charitable, and I think that the best way to think about this is that these groups have different conceptions of what racial progress looks like. So if racial progress only can mean proportional representation, if it can only mean that you're embracing a kind of nationalist synthesis in which actually, if you are not maintaining this kind of rigid, impermeable separation, then that is very different from the anti-racialist view. So the anti-racialist view is that when you're thinking about disparities, well, look to disparities among white Americans. White Americans with French surnames have very different and oftentimes worse economic outcomes than white Americans with Italian surnames. That is a pretty persistent pattern. And yet you don't actually see a lot of white Americans with French surnames, identifying themselves as victims of racist oppression or racist injustice. You don't see this become a kind of major consideration of public policy, bracketing whether or not it should be. Maybe we should have racial preferences for the descendants of Cajuns. But again, it's just treated very, very differently, right? So I guess an anti-racialist would say that you're always going to have different patterns with different groups. Groups have fuzzy boundaries, and that's just kind of a natural part of life. So for the anti-racialist, progress would mean maybe not fixating as much on those differences. Whereas to the anti-racist, that does not give you the kind of meaningful metric, the meaningful yardstick of progress. Another view, Norman Podhoretz famously expressed this view decades ago, is that what you want is a kind of blending. What you want is amalgamation of the population. What you want is, basically the blurring of boundaries so that they're not quite as distinct as they had been. Think about the kind of melting pot that you've seen among Americans of European origin. But I guess the anti-racist view would be you should not have to subsume your identity in that way. So I guess that when I say they both want racial progress, I'm trying to take them at their word, trying to take them on their own terms. It's just that these are two visions of racial progress that are not compatible.
Could I reform Corbin's question just to try to deepen the understanding here? Would you say that anti-racialists are interested in good race relations, that is, harmony between races, and that's what's in the forefront? Whereas anti-racists are interested in what they regard as racial equity, not in good race relations. I'm sure everyone would like to have good race relations, but if we're identifying what is our agenda, what are we trying to accomplish with the policies that we want. On the one hand, we have people who want good relations between people of different races, and on the other hand, we want people who are aimed at fairness or equity in race relations.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess you're throwing me a lifeline here, and I'm not taking it because, I guess the way that I would put it is that the anti-racialist perspective, which, by the way, is inchoate, and part of what I'm trying to do is put a label on something that I think is, again, it doesn't have many articulate champions, as I mentioned earlier on. So I guess the anti-racialist perspective would actually, be, we're not thinking about this as different corporate entities, right? So, many of you guys will be familiar with, the Ottoman Empire. You had a millet system. Or in Holland, you had these kind of parallel institutions for Catholics and Protestants and socialists. They had the separate pillars of society. The anti-racist vision is actually one of these pillars, in which there are almost negotiations, across these pillars, and each pillar gets its place. In Canada, the Québécois, basically have certain rights and privileges that, folks from other provinces don't have. There is this bargain that Quebec is going to be overrepresented relative to other provinces because, again, it's a kind of multinational framework. I guess the anti-racialist view is that, well, no. I mean, actually, people are people, and that actually these ethnic identities are mostly private, and that to the extent we identify race at all, it's more of a concession than something that we really embrace or think of as something that, we want to own.
So, on the list of priorities, just from your own perspective as an anti-racialist, how would you order priority good relations between races and justice or fairness in racial matters?
I'm so sorry, I just don't think about it in these terms. So I guess even the term race relations, I don't want to be tiresome, I'm sorry, but just, kind of implies that there are these separate and distinct races, you know what I mean? So when I say, whiteness versus mainstreamness, one way to think about it is that white is a residual category, okay? So think about how there's been this movement in the Washington Post, they embrace this, to capitalize black and to not capitalize white. And there are some people who are saying, well, that's really obnoxious because that's not parity. Why aren't you capitalizing white? But actually, there is a reason for this. And the reason is that, and not very well understood by the people of the Washington Post themselves in some cases, but it's the idea that black Americans are a distinct group. Okay? And white Americans are not a distinct kind of ethno-cultural group, and we can debate about that, right? But this is the group that is the American mainstream majority group that, a third generation Japanese American is really a part of, right? So in a way, using that lowercase white term introduces a ton of confusion, which is why I like to use the term mainstream. So then you're talking about kind of...
Does the Washington Post spell Japanese American with a lowercase j?
They don't, which is, that's very, and look, I'm not here to defend the orthographic, kind of tactics of them or any other institution. But I think that, in the context of kind of multinational states, in Canada, and Heath talks about this, they talk about Quebec and the ROC. Quebec, and the rest of Canada. So when you think about the US context, you could think about the mainstream category as the category that is the residual category of folks who do not belong to this highly endogamous group that is kind of very marked and separate and distinct. And I think that is kind of a useful way to think about it. Hopefully not too confusing.
Professor Hicks. Let John bring you the microphone, Zena. Yeah, we'll catch it on the tape that way.
Yes, I'm very sympathetic to the point of view you presented, but as some people here already know, I'm a contrarian, so if I hear something I'm sympathetic to, then I turn against myself. So I think my concern is I appreciate the charity towards the anti-racists, but I wonder whether it doesn't obscure something important, which you alluded to, which is the terrible effect on race relations among elites that anti-racists are causing and have caused. So I feel like the thing that I've seen in being someone who's being an academic mostly around majority white institutions with some anti-racist component is a complete degeneration of race relations, so to speak, in those communities. And because most people charitably want to take the anti-racists seriously on their word, there hasn't been an attempt to really confront, that I know of, the damage to these communities, these elite communities. And I wonder how that's going to play out, given that, as you put it, the anti-racialist movement is something which is happening outside the elites. What's going to happen to these elite communities that are really have much worse race relations than I remember them ever having?
So I should be clearer in saying that I do not think that the anti-racist tendency is a good or healthy one. I do not think that it's played an especially constructive role certainly in the life of the university or many other institutions besides. There was a little riff here in which I was talking about some of the complexity of what we're dealing with here. Okay, so I mentioned the idea of leveraging a history that has a huge amount of moral weight. And basically, individuals, look, this is very fraught, this is very complicated, and, we risk going to the territory of thinking about psychological dynamics, right? But let's say that there's a universe of people we will describe as plausibly belonging to a kind of marginalized group according to the very lax standards of the US Census, okay? So that's, kind of one kind of big category. Then you have people who have a kind of deep, long, multi-generational experience of cumulative disadvantage. In the Venn diagram of people in this category and that category, there's not a ton of overlap when it comes to the faculty lounge, at an elite selective institution. There might be some, but it's not all that much. That's something that is, by the way, not just true when we're talking about Black Americans, let's say. It's true of many, many different groups. A large majority of Americans do not live, more than 30 minutes away from where they grew up. But if you look at this room, I suspect that actually quite a lot of people live 30. I don't, by the way. So I'm part of the downtrodden majority. So I think that part of what you see is this intense psychological fragility that stems from being in these majority white institutions and having this kind of weird, this weird conflict, where on the one hand, you're saying, racial preferences are absolutely essential. We must fight for them. To oppose them is to be a noxious racist. On the other hand, how dare you suggest that I'm a beneficiary of them? To suggest that I'm a beneficiary of them is to demean me, to denigrate my achievements, my accomplishments. It's very confusing. I remember reading an article some years ago about a young woman, a graduate of the Trinity School, a very elite private secondary school in New York City, who then later attended an elite Ivy League university. And she was talking about how some of her high school classmates, suggested that she was admitted to this university because she belonged to an underrepresented group. And she was weeping because of it, or so said the article. And it's just interesting just thinking about that. It's been kind of several years. and you're still crying about that. I mean, that's just, kind of really hurtful and sad. Now, could it be that someone, and again, I hesitate to generalize, but to have that experience, to then go into contentious debates, to see yourself and the kind of validity or soundness or importance of your discipline questioned. Many of you are familiar with the dynamic in which students who are beneficiaries of large racial preferences will oftentimes switch majors from a more demanding one to a less demanding one. Then you have concentrations of folks in certain fields of study where there are these kind of echo chamber dynamics. There are these mutually reinforcing dynamics. And those departments, those kind of lines of inquiry become really important within a modern university. There's a lot going on, and you guys frankly know much more about it than I do, but I do think that that's another dimension of how what is an ideological idea interacts with a complicated psychological condition experienced by a group of people who both experience privilege and some, guilt and resentment over that privilege.
Follow up, Zena?
Yeah, sure. So that's helpful and interesting, and I also agree with that. But I think the concern that came to me when I was listening to the talk was not what causes these terrible race dynamics in communities like these, but what's the future for them look like? That is, especially because they often are characterized by these kinds of conflicts. So, for instance, there's different sides, right? So there's like the progressive white person who thinks they're being anti-racist, but is in fact really patronizing to the person who's not white.
So, sorry, I haven't answered your question, Zena. Just what I take to be your question, which is that the legitimacy of these institutions is diminishing. And right now we have, we've had serious civil violence at Columbia University that is now very visible to people around the country. It is motivated in no small part by what you might think of as an anti-racist or anti-racist adjacent sensibility. And what we also have are new institutions that are emerging in different parts of the country. You have public officials in some parts of the country, mostly in red states, though not exclusively, who are saying we are going to change the orientation of our institutions and we are going to offer some meaningful competition. So forgive me for interrupting, but I think that the kind of real answer to this is that these institutions that cannot solve this problem, that cannot, build a healthier academic and civic culture, deserve to be diminished. And I think that there's going to be an ongoing campaign to make that happen. And I think it's already achieving some success, and I think that success will continue. So I imagine, we'll have more to talk about, and I'd be delighted to talk to you afterwards. But that's my short answer.
Okay.
Good. Down here, Professor Jackson.
I, too, am sympathetic to a lot of what you described as anti-racialism, the agenda, the principles. I do find it hard to not still think of myself as also anti-racist in the old sort of King sense, and I know you define that phrase in a technical way. But again, from someone who's sympathetic to the anti-racialist cause, are there ways to bring the two sides together nonetheless with all their differences? And in particular, I wonder what you think about reparations for slavery. And that I know, many conservatives, including many conservative friends of my own, are against it. Many liberals think it just will never happen. But is there any argument to be made to the following effect? If we do want to turn away from sort of divisive emphasis on race and focus on race, might it not serve that purpose for a public acknowledgement of the evils of slavery, reparations, maybe on the lines of Randall Robinson's The Debt, where you put money in escrow? Argument not being that all white people were slave owners or the like, but you could make a pretty strong case that whites in America did receive unjust enrichment, like receiving stolen property, but that acknowledging that, putting funds, again, in escrow accounts for black businesses, black education, might allow us then to say, okay, now we need and can move much further away from this emphasis on race and talk about the agenda you're promoting, which I second. What do you think about that?
I won't claim to have thought about this as deeply as perhaps I ought to have, but I will commend to you an essay written by my colleague Charles Lehman. So, I think typically when people think about reparations, they think about reparations that are paid by a corporate entity, the United States, rather than by, Randall Robinson, Ta-Nehisi Coates, et cetera. That's what they have in mind. But inevitably, thoughts turn to, well, what is the population that would benefit from these reparations, and what would be the population that would pay them? And again, everyone pays them, right? But that's how people think, myself included. And one of the tricky things is that if you look at the evolution of the U.S. population since 1865, that kind of Anglo stock population that existed in the country then is so markedly different from the population that we have right now. And so inevitably you get a lot of folks who are wondering, well, wait a second, how am I implicated in this question? You could say that we are all implicated, again, as citizens of the United States, but even there's an interesting question about the sacrifices that were made to secure emancipation and much else, the transfers of resources, some of which were race conscious. And again, I'm not saying that therefore is like, therefore a complex moral question is resolved. It's just that if you're really thinking about this rigorously, it's not obvious that you would come up with a totally easy answer. And then there's the fact that if you look at the universe of Afro descendants in the United States, again, as we discussed, there is enormous complexity to it. So, again, we talked about over 20%. It's first and second generation. You have a larger component, particularly in groups that have high education attainment and high household incomes that are multiracial. That's a group that's, again, this is self-identification, but grown something like, 80x. So I think that these are all things that have some bearing on the question. My view, like Martin Luther King's view, is that basically race-neutral policies are typically the best way to address these kind of challenges of kind of entrenched disadvantage and marginalization. And my sense is that reparations discourse, one can imagine it, kind of in a different society. If one of my good friends once joked, if American society consisted of Koreans and Black Americans, the reparations check would have been written a long time ago, and then the message would have been, we are absolutely not going to talk about this ever again. There will be no acknowledgement. We will never discuss it again. There will be no renegotiations. That's not how American society works, partly because these are not groups that are hermetically sealed off from each other. So that's my sense.
There would be ways to structure it so you wouldn't be indicting particular individuals or even rewarding particular individuals.
Of course, I tried to address that, but I think that is necessarily how people think about this in a kind of larger political context.
But could it not be exactly the sort of symbolic statement by the corporate entity that allows us to move on? And I'll be blunt and put you on the spot. If you're a senator and this comes up for a vote, do you vote yay or nay for reparations?
I would vote nay. But, honestly, if President Biden wants to offer a fulsome apology for slavery, it certainly wouldn't be the worst thing that he's done this week. I think that would be, perfectly fine.
I wonder what, Tim, you and Reihan would think if the following were the case. Just imagine that this is true, that reparations would advance the cause of justice and harm the cause of racial harmony. It would result in resentment. It would make race relations worse, but advance the cause of justice.
That's impossible. I don't think you can advance the cause of justice and make race relations worse. I honestly do think they're holistic. If you promote the
Is that a priori?
well, I think.
So, isn't it easy enough, Tim, to
I'm Roman Catholic, so you believe in the unity of the virtues. I think to serve justice is not going to serve an evil end.
But surely the following would be possible. Given our fallen human condition, which we agree on, right? Original sin, that business back in the garden. That let's assume that many people would resent, rightly or wrongly, the paying of reparations, feel they had been wronged for crimes they didn't commit, despite whatever education program, the Jackson program we'll call it, to educate them to think right. There would be resentment, as a result of which race relations would get worse. Would it still be justified because of the advance of justice?
It would depend on how bad the consequences were.
Okay.
And I hear you. And
Yeah.
I tell my students all the time, there are three dimensions of the moral life. There's motive, there's form of action, and there's consequences. And you have to weigh them all. The fact you're performing a just action, if it has horrific consequences, right. But I would still argue that if you were promoting justice, you could explain if they're taking it wrongly and offended by it. Because I would see it exactly, again, as allowing us to get beyond the resentments, acknowledge the true injustice of slavery, and then say, let's get beyond it. We're not going to indict individuals, but we are going to try to support black business and education. But let's get beyond it. And then, again, I think the anti-racialist agenda would have more credibility.
I will just note briefly, you have a kind of emerging movement of American descendants of slaves, ADOS, and one of the motivations behind this is partly this question of legitimacy. Who is entitled to reparations and who is not, and I think that frankly is a debate that will keep this at bay as a serious proposal for a very, very long time. And it's not going to happen because it's incoherent, would be my argument. But
Let's move to this side of the room, over there. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your very thoughtful comments today. I really enjoyed them. Just to push back perhaps on the reparations a bit and throw out just some thoughts on other policy prescriptions for the Manhattan Institute. Wanted to share experiences of my own wife, who's done a lot of volunteering in Trenton for organizations like Homefront, giving back to the community, trying to help disadvantaged women. I think two observations she's had, and I think she's become very disenchanted by the experience, even though she has the most wonderful heart, is one, that there is such an overreach of the welfare state that there are literally a litany of so many different programs available to these women that in a lot of cases it works counter to their best interests, meaning if they do any kind of work above some baseline, if they enter into a marriage, a lot of these benefits go away and they become trapped in these cycles. And the second point, and so I would just push back the idea that kind of more government welfare solves the problem here.
sorry, are you suggesting that I said that more government welfare solves the problem? Okay, got it.
Saying,
Got it.
Writing checks doesn't really solve any of the structural problems. And then the second point is just we didn't really talk about the breakdown of the family unit, but my wife met a number of women in Trenton.
How much time do you have?
I know you have today, but that's a serious, big part of this as well for particularly a lot of these disadvantaged communities. And my wife met a number of women there who literally told her that they never knew anyone who was ever married. And so I would just say that the idea that the government is part of the solution, to harken back to some presidents of the past, that's an issue. So anyway, just some thoughts and observations for you.
So one thing that is really striking is that you measure what you can measure. You measure what is tractable. And for a variety of reasons, when you're looking at contemporary social science, it's just suffused with a racial perspective because we have an abundance of racial data. And one thing I've always wondered about is this. If you were to, for example, look at school discipline and how school disciplinary actions vary across students, not by race, but by some multidimensional index that's looking at father absence, but also multi-partner fertility, and a variety of other adverse childhood experiences. What would you find? How different would it look? Would you identify patterns that are actually a lot more telling than merely looking at race? And my intuition is that the answer is yes. That's another reason why I guess I am a skeptic of what we're calling racialism. I understand why, France is having a live debate right now about the wisdom of collecting racial data, whether or not they ought to start. But I guess I just really believe that if you have this very simplistic, crude framework, you will tell any number of just so stories about it. You know what I mean? About why you have these particular patterns, why you have this kind of persistent disadvantage. One of my colleagues, the aforementioned Zach Goldberg, has done work on what he calls the disparity fallacy. So, what he said is, if you tell people, here are incomes of Black Americans, here are incomes of white Americans, here are incomes of Asian Americans, do you believe that these are the product of racism? And they'll say yes. If you talk to them about incomes among Americans of European descent, as we kind of touched on briefly earlier, first, and then you ask them the same question, then they'll say no. Because if you actually understand that, the world is just incredibly rich and complex. There's a guy, Orlando Patterson, who published a book, a kind of celebrated Harvard sociologist, who wrote a book called The Ordeal of Integration. I think this was published in 2000. And one thing he introduced is what he called the principle of infrangibility. That is, he suggested that rather than comparing black Americans to white Americans, what we ought to do is compare black Americans to a composite average of Americans. Because, kind of why would you happen to compare these particular groups? You know what I mean? Like, why would that be the thing that we obsess over? When there's a universe of other groups as well that we might have in mind. It's been kind of much remarked upon that if you look at Asian Americans who now represent around 7% of the U.S. population, this is a group that is itself incredibly internally diverse, but is also a group that has markedly different, and markedly better education and economic outcomes. Kind of much less father absence, et cetera, than white Americans. Now, again, you could say that this is a selected population, et cetera. There are kind of a lot of things that can explain that. But, I just think that, it's funny. There's a lot of talk about America becoming a majority-minority society. And if you look at folks under 18, that's already true. But it hasn't been this revolutionary change that people expect in the 1990s, because again, there are things that matter a lot more than race, and actually those kind of, the ethno-racial pentagon, as the historian David Hollinger called it, just doesn't actually describe the kind of complex textured reality of American life. And I think that, your point is very well taken. I think that race is often a distraction from the things that really matter.
Yes, Pierre.
Thank you so much for a good talk, always stimulating. I'd like to ask a question about intersectionality, by which I mean the intersection of anti-racism with cultural Marxism, which in my view is a Foucaultian philosophical mindset, which is, you mentioned what's happening even today at Columbia and elsewhere on other campuses, which looks like, to me, a logical outcome for that intersectionality that may be driving a lot of this anti-racism, which is in some sense to say that the problem is really transcending race and it's getting beyond and rather more into ideological warfare.
This is not necessarily very responsive to your excellent question and really your excellent comment. I guess I'm struck by this idea that the idea of racism has a great deal of moral weight in American society for good reason. And I guess my uncharitable interpretation is that, you basically saw in the wake of the Soviet collapse this kind of turn away from Marxism, certainly in kind of mainstream public life. And kind of what you saw is people leveraging that fact that there really is a history of racist oppression, there is a deep sense of guilt surrounding it, and then kind of making use of that to advance a series of kind of collectivist ideas and projects that people might otherwise be reluctant to embrace. So if you say that equality of opportunity is laissez-faire or colorblind racism, and that only equity will actually kind of redress this kind of grave historical injustice, you're smuggling in a whole set of other ideas, kind of a mix of, kind of class war, or call it egalitarianism, or call it collectivism, but you're kind of bringing that in. One person I think of as really talented kind of doing this in kind of mainstream public life is Senator Elizabeth Warren, who will routinely talk about environmental racism, medical racism, you name it, when she's referencing disparities, and then the solution for medical racism is single-payer healthcare. The solution for environmental racism is essentially, kind of green energy central planning, and, basically handing hundreds of millions of dollars to kind of racial justice pressure group nonprofits that are kind of certified by local community colleges. I mean, it's all just, stuff that, if it didn't have that weight, if it didn't have that moral authority of, hey, we're representing the oppressed, then I think that I guess more people would find these ideas laughable. But that's part of what I'm suggesting about this idea that, well, wait a second, what if our politics and what if these kind of conflicts over our kind of vision for the racial future are between one multi-ethnic coalition and another multi-ethnic coalition? then suddenly you don't actually have that moral imprimatur. You don't have that same kind of authority. One thing that's really striking, in these patterns of political polarization, the kind of sorting and resorting of the electorate, is that yes, you have a lot of working class, younger people of color who are moving right, but one group that has actually moved left is affluent, college-educated people of color. And that's interesting, because if you think of it, and again, this isn't necessarily correct, this isn't necessarily causal, but tell the story. That if you're someone who belongs to, if you care about whether or not you're getting into Yale Law School, your race matters to you a lot more than if you care about running a franchise business and kind of saving up for it. You know what I mean? Race has bearing on your life in either scenario. But in one case, oh my gosh, this could potentially be your linchpin. This could be your trump card. This could be something that's extremely meaningful to you, that differentiates you, that's something that has a huge amount of weight. But if you're someone who's part of this kind of broad working class, this broad lower middle class, this broad middle class, that is not actually engaging with these selective institutions, it could affect you if you want to join a fire department or something like that. But it just, kind of interacts with your life in a different kind of way. And I think that is really important and has bearing for the tone and tenor of these debates in elite spaces too.
Up there, yes, sir. John will bring you the microphone.
Yes, I find it hard not to agree with the principles you've laid out this evening. To me, they make a lot of common sense. And I'm glad to hear that you're somewhat of an optimist in race relations going forward in America. I'm just wondering if you see, as I might see, a challenge going forward in regard to equal application of the law. And what I mean by that is people who are more or less maybe impoverished have a more difficult time when it comes to sentencing when they break the law. You break the law, you should pay the price. Those who are in power, and just to give a few examples, banks, institutions that redline, they pay a fine. It's a way of doing business. But the population's been harmed by them. They can afford to pay that fine and continue doing business. Sometimes they continue doing business the same way. So if you're a cynic, a person who's cynical and maybe somewhat distant from what's going on in America every day and the powerful areas, do you see this as a challenge going forward to make things better in terms of race relations? I don't know if you see it the same way I do, that there is maybe a slant, that there's not equal application of the law.
Well, I guess, again, it depends on what you see as improving race relations, kind of what do you see as the kind of, the kind of ultimate goal. I don't think I did an adequate job of making the case for optimism. So I'll just, go ahead and throw out a couple of propositions that hopefully, will be responsive to your question. So during the civil rights era, there is a line of argument, which I find convincing, that one reason why the kind of American, political economic elite moved on these issues is because of the Cold War. It's because basically Soviet propaganda about American racism and discrimination was awfully effective because it was grounded in truth. And that propaganda, wound up having a real influence in the kind of battle for hearts and minds in the Afro-Asian world, in these kind of newly independent states that the United States and the Soviets were kind of competing for, the favor of. So right now, I think we have a different geopolitical competition. We have a rivalry with China. And if you think about that rivalry, the character of that rivalry, my sense is that this is the first true peer competitor, we faced since our kind of rise to power. And what that means is that there are certain things that you can indulge in when you have a margin of safety that you might not be able to indulge in when you don't have a margin of safety. So I think that if you were to say that the idea of rigorous meritocracy, and I know that term can mean many different things and applies differently in different domains, but just the idea that we're going to select people who are going to be the best, most capable, most effective at a given high-stakes job. I think that idea is buoyed by the sense that margin of safety is smaller than it had been. I also think that I really do believe that basically, in the 90s, when I was growing up and kind of coming of age in these kind of debates, we were talking about multiculturalism. And we were talking not just about the particularities of the black experience, but also about this idea that there was going to be this emerging, but also marginalized Mexican origin population. I was a student of Sam Huntington, and he really believed that you were going to have this kind of Spanish-speaking presence in the American Southwest that was going to become a kind of U.S. Quebec that could represent a real threat of fragmentation. In the United States. And that just hasn't borne out. It really has been that kind of this population, the residual population kind of dynamic. But then even if you look at the hardest case, look at the Black American population, this is a population that in various ways, there actually really is a story of upward mobility. There is a story of some modicum of permeability, of complexity, of advancement. And so I think that, kind of a combination of these things, I think are going to push us in this healthier direction. The other thing is the kind of self-assertion of basically these red state institutions that are saying that we're going to kind of chart a different course. I think that competition is really, really potent. And when that competition is a competition, again, between one multi-ethnic coalition and another multi-ethnic coalition, suddenly that multi-ethnic coalition that says that we reject race obsession that is kind of anti-meritocratic in orientation, suddenly you're cooking with gas. Suddenly you can actually really, make a difference. So I don't know if that answers your question about banks and cynicism, but I hope it gives you a sense of why I'm more optimistic.
Yes, ma'am. All right, there we go. Yeah, he's going to bring you a microphone, so we'll catch it on tape. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you okay? You handed off the ball. Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a quick clarifying question that might lead to another question. So picking back of the gentleman's questions about reparations, I'm wondering to reframe this question somewhat in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. If you had been a senator, would you have voted yea or nay for reparations in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War?
My instinct is that devoting more resources to aiding the freedmen population would have been the right thing to do. Would I have characterized them as reparations? I'm not sure, but I think that the Reconstruction era was defined by a lot of missed opportunities and serious failures. I suspect from your question that you're someone who's kind of thought a lot more deeply about this than I have, at least recently. But my instinct is that, that there was a real collective failure, then it was, on many different fronts. Would I? But I'd have to kind of know more about the time and kind of what was tractable and kind of what would have actually stuck. So for example, is this understood as a kind of one-off? Is it understood? There are kind of so many things. Also, is it something you would be able to enforce meaningfully? I think it would have been a really interesting time to be alive. I suspect that I would not have been in the Senate at that time. Not a lot of Bengalis loose in the country, but yeah. I don't consider it, crazy.
Not so much reparations as, would you consider it a race-conscious policy?
Well, I don't think you'd even, these are all provisional answers because I haven't thought about this before. I think in a sense, enslavement was something that could be, this was a condition of race slavery. But also, one could talk about freedmen, right? Because actually you did have some number of people who were, both experienced intense marginalization, but who are not enslaved. It was a kind of small population, but it was a kind of meaningful population. In the history of enslavement and manumission, it is really interesting to look at the history of New York State, where I'm from, because, there was a time when actually, kind of black voters were a pivotal constituency in the politics of New York State. And then you had the kind of Jacksonians come in and actually strip that population of votes. Did they do that out of racial animus, or did they do that out of political calculation? I think that there's some evidence to suggest that it was actually more the latter than the former. I think that there's a flattening of American history that happens, but I'm not a historian. So, but I guess what I'm saying is that I think the freedmen were the relevant population, right? And I think that, there may well have been some advantage to addressing other kind of, marginalized populations at that time, but I think that there actually was the challenges of kind of racial disadvantage and what to do with the formerly enslaved were not totally coterminous.
So maybe to bring that, sorry, just last question, to bring that debate into the present. So you have race as a proxy for slavery, slavery as a proxy for race, or as an
really imperfect one. Yeah.
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 But I guess
Way
I'm
less
thinking-
imperfect now than it was back then.
So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the imperfection with regards to affirmative action, and specifically steps that universities have taken in the wake of the overturning of affirmative action to maintain a diverse population, right? So during the Supreme Court arguments, there's a lot of talk about like, oh, if we, elevated certain criteria that ended up elevating a more diverse population, would that be legitimate? And I'm not sure that was even hashed out in the opinion so much. But you're seeing that the next frontier of affirmative action debates, like there was, I think, a Virginia case about standardized tests, right? So we're going to make this test, get rid of it entirely. It's a race-neutral decision, but it will benefit certain populations more than others. So I'm wondering if you see an analogy between freedmen versus slaves, and then students would benefit from a no-test policy, but then ends up benefiting certain groups more than others because there is a correlation between slaves and black people back then, as there is a correlation between certain groups that would benefit from getting rid of standardized tests versus having one in place.
Can you give me another, can you give me another example, just to help me kind of?
Yeah, so I think we're kind of slicing the bologna a bit thin when we're saying that, like, oh, Reconstruction was aimed at helping enslaved people more generally and not so much African Americans, because we had a few people on the margins who were enslaved, but not African American.
No, well, I don't know if we had any, but I was referring to you had people who were not enslaved who were black.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so in that sense, it sounds like you're saying that is not a race-conscious policy, because we're promoting a status, we're giving it to enslaved people, but not to African Americans. It just so happens that...
Well, we're so deep in the hypotheticals here that...
No, but I mean, but you are, I mean, when I asked you if it was a race-conscious policy, you said probably not, because we're talking more about freedmen versus African Americans. Is that true?
I think that if you were someone who is a slave in the American South and you are probably experiencing pretty grinding poverty and dislocation, I think it would have been reasonable to try to do more for those folks. I don't know. I mean,
would you consider it a race-conscious policy?
It's not a policy that applies to everyone based on their blood quantum or kind of something like that. I'm sorry for not playing along.
Maybe this will help. So let's say that we took Professor Jackson's advice and said, you know what, the way to move forward here is with a reparations program. The beneficiaries of the reparations, I'm assuming, Tim, you can tell me if this is wrong, would not be a racial category, black. It would be descendants of slaves. So Barack Obama would not qualify. Recent immigrants from Africa would not qualify. It would, the actual reference group would be those whose ancestors were in slavery. Would that be right?
Well, not according to Randall Robinson, and I think his argument would be it's too difficult to determine that lineage. And his argument would be, again, whether or not you were enslaved or whether or not you were a slave owner, whites generally tended to benefit from slavery and from remunerated labor.
But the goal is not to punish.
After the Civil War.
But the goal is not to punish.
And so on. And again, you're trying to compensate for that fact by not payments to individuals, declaring you're righteous or indictments of others saying you're not righteous, but acknowledging as a country that slavery did build the country in part. And in a sense, we're going to give you your 40 acres and a mule, but rather late. Reconstruction failed, but put it this way, if you think it was appropriate right after the Civil War, I can't imagine why you wouldn't think, because they weren't given their 40 acres and a mule, why it wouldn't be appropriate now, again, precisely as a means to acknowledge an injustice, but then move beyond it and get beyond it.
Yeah, I just think this is incredibly unwise. And I do think that actually there is a material difference, kind of when you kind of, so this is why it was a useful hypothetical to think about what's happening immediately afterwards. I guess my point was that I don't think this has to be framed as racial reparations. You're asking me whether, I think that these are anachronisms, talking about whether it's a race-conscious policy or not, which is why I'm kind of resisting the hypothetical. So I don't mean to be...
I want to get one more question.
But is there a question about standardized tests?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm going to do
I had a sense that you were trying to drive at something, so okay.
Policy of getting rid of standardized tests at the selective high school.
Yes.
That would have the obvious consequence of privileging certain
Okay.
Say African Americans over Asians. Do you think that is a race-conscious policy that is at odds with the recent affirmative action decision?
So this is a kind of big debate that's happening now, and the truth is that I'm kind of ambivalent about it because there are also top 10 policies and what have you. There's the Coalition for TJ case, and I know a lot of smart people are on both sides of this argument. And then it goes to intentionality when you're looking at the kind of school officials in Fairfax County. It seemed pretty clear that their intention was to reduce what they saw as the overrepresentation of students of Asian origin. That seems pretty smarmy and pretty bad. But also, is it necessarily unlawful? I'm not the right person to ask, but I certainly have plenty of colleagues who believe that it is.
Final question, Professor Conti.
Maybe, so we don't run too long here, just maybe two open-ended points. You can respond to either or neither of them. One, you gestured to, you talked a little bit about the Quebecois and the Basque case, but just how would anti-racialism look in a more comparative perspective? Obviously, America is not the only country dealing with intense racial tensions. So if you think about, across Europe now, they're, I would say, at a peak of racial tension. Does anti-racialism kind of directly apply in those contexts? An interesting thing in those contexts, you're dealing primarily with recent immigrants, as opposed to the long American legacy with African Americans. And does that change thing? And then I guess that goes to the second point. Again, don't feel obliged to respond to either of this, but does anti-racialism tell us anything directly about immigration policy? Another of the things that you've talked about. It seems just from what you've said here that you could be an anti-racialist who's very permissive or very restrictive about immigration. And maybe you want that because you want anti-racialism to be a separate kind of place where you can set up your tent pole and rally a large camp behind it, but maybe it doesn't in your mind, and actually it suggests one thing or the other about immigration. So just curious to hear your thoughts on either of those points.
Really appreciate that. So I think that, for the reasons you mentioned, I think that the Black experience in the US is so unique that it does make it hard to draw one-to-one comparisons. I often think that it's more useful to think about the United States and race in the United States in the context of other post-slavery Western Hemisphere societies, because when you look at the kind of broader Black Atlantic, when you look at these kind of Afro-Caribbean, African populations in other modern market democracies, their experiences are oftentimes really different, though you actually do see some shared patterns. One thing that so one example is just, France, which obviously is in the middle of a ferocious debate about this, but I think the kind of Republican resistance to race as a category is an interesting example. Now, is it a successful case of anti-racialism as a project? It's more like this was a default orientation that is now very contested in this really different context. Gosh, there's so much to say here. So I think that with regard to immigration, this is so fascinating because if you look at Senegalese immigrants in France, you see drastically different integration outcomes for Senegalese Christians versus Senegalese Muslims. And this is a category that exists, again, ethno-religious affiliation in the domain of civil society. It's not these kind of like encoded racial categories. But it just kind of goes to the fact that, things that we think of as kind of racial discrimination oftentimes have this complex dialogic element to them. That is, there's a community that kind of wants to preserve its integrity and its identity. And also there's a community that, thinks of itself, what is its orientation? Do we think of ourselves as people who are going to be integrated into an existing society? Or do we think of ourselves as people who are very explicitly a diaspora? When I think about a healthy anti-racialism, I don't think about a world that is lacking in diversity or pluralism. I think about a world in which we think about ethnic identity, membership as something that is chosen, reaffirmed, and something that is real, something that is kind of a reflection of networks, rather than something that is kind of created through government fiat and created through kind of chasing government privileges. There's this great research by these economists Trejo and Antman, they call incentives to identify. And what they look at is basically look at people on the margin. People of mixed ancestry who, in our minds, we can think of them as having the option to choose to identify with a given group or not. And what they found is that there are big responses to bans on racial preferences or reversing bans on racial preferences. When you introduce a ban on racial preferences, people of mixed Asian origin will become more likely to identify as Asian. They'll become, in the other, it's just really fascinating. People are exquisitely sensitive to these incentives. And I think that that's, kind of one reason why I think that actually the kind of categories and how they're entrenched really matters a lot. Because I think of it as kind of, we want a free society. We want a kind of more fluid society. That doesn't mean that you don't have really kind of clannish, thick, solidaristic groups, but we want them to exist not because of chasing these incentives, but because they represent a kind of authentic cultural formation. Now, with respect to immigration, one way that I think about this is not directly responsive, but is that, I think for a long time, the kind of view of immigration on the right was, call it the Tucker Carlson view, which is that immigration represents a direct demographic threat to conservative political success. I think that this is actually being scrambled now for all of the kind of reasons that I laid out earlier. When you see that these kind of second plus generation people of Latin origin, of Asian origin seem to be moving politically, that suddenly kind of takes you away from this kind of intense defensive crouch and this, kind of like fear and anxiety that kind of any inward migration is necessarily going to mean, the kind of diminishment of your kind of political power. I think that that's kind of a work in progress, but I think that that's interesting. There are many other things that are kind of related to this in a complicated way, but I think that that's something that's going to kind of like trickle out into the discourse and already is. But there's another element, which is the interaction between low birth rates and high inflows. Canada is in a very different place than we are because their inflows are drastically higher than our inflows are. By 2041, Canada is going to have a population that is, projected to have a population that's 49% first and second generation. And the visible minority share of the population is also going to be drastically higher, and there's going to be an intense geographical divide. I'm not a Canadian public official, I could kind of tell them kind of how to roll with that. But I think that that is something that is going to kind of introduce interesting complexities beyond thinking of people purely as automatons who are kind of, part of the labor force. Thinking about how are these populations going to be integrated, how are they going to become part of the national story, I think it's something that people kind of ought to think about in the context of this kind of fertility collapse. And I think that that is something that is also shaping our race debates in other kind of complicated ways.
Good. Please join me in thanking Reihan Salam. Thank you very much.